In the spring of 1834, in the quiet rolling hills of central Virginia, something was uncovered that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. Authorities stumbled upon a farmhouse, ordinary from the outside, but beneath it, 47 children were found. Ages 6 to 16. Shackled. Malnourished. Terrified. They looked nothing alike. They spoke in different tongues. And when asked who had brought them there, every trembling voice whispered the same name. Mother Sullivan. The sheriff's report, locked away for more than a century in the Henrico County archives, described horrors so disturbing that 3 of the officers resigned within days. And the most unsettling truth? Constance Sullivan had been running this twisted operation for over 20 years, unnoticed. The children called her mother. But the truth behind that name was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. This channel is not for everyone. It's only for the bravest souls, those willing to confront the darkest corners of history. If you've stayed with me this far, you're not like most people. You already know, some truths are too terrifying to look away from. So hit subscribe and join our circle of truth seekers. And in the comments, tell me, what state are you listening from? And more importantly, could you handle hearing stories like this, if they happened in your very own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then, and still puzzles historians today, is simple. How could such a massive operation remain invisible, in a rural town where everyone knew each other's business? Virginia, 1834. A state caught between two worlds. The old plantation order still reigned supreme, but whispers of industry from the north were creeping in. In the middle of this, you had Millbrook. 50 families. Tobacco and corn farmers. Trading at Henderson's general store. Gathering in the one-room schoolhouse for lessons, church meetings, and dances. The Sullivan farm sat quietly on the outskirts, 200 acres of fertile land, a neat wooden farmhouse in federal style, painted white, with a porch wrapping around its frame. Behind it, a red barn, a chicken coop, and a smokehouse completed the picture. To anyone passing on the dusty road to Richmond, it was nothing but another unremarkable Virginia farm. But what made the Sullivan property unique was hidden underground. Ezra Sullivan, who bought the land in 1809, spent years expanding the basement beneath his house. Unlike most homes of the time, which had only simple root cellars, Ezra had workers dig deeper, wider. They were paid well, always in cash, and were told not to ask questions. None of them ever saw the finished structure. His wife, Constance Sullivan, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a young bride. Neighbors remembered her clearly, striking dark hair, a soft voice, a calm manner. She dressed plainly but neatly, appeared at Methodist services when her health allowed, and always presented herself as charitable. When people noticed strange children near the farm, Constance offered a simple explanation: they were orphans from her family in Pennsylvania, taken in until proper homes could be found. It was a story that fit the times. Orphan children were common, and the community accepted her reasoning. Even Mrs. Henderson at the store recalled glimpsing small faces peeking nervously from the Sullivan wagon. The children never spoke. But Constance explained they were shy, traumatized, and needed time. And people believed her. Every 2 weeks, she came with long lists and bundles of cash. She purchased huge amounts of flour, pork, molasses, and salt. More than any childless couple should need. When questioned, she gently reminded the shopkeeper about the orphans. She also bought unusual amounts of medicine, always explaining that the children often arrived sick. Neighbors noticed the odd routines of the Sullivan farm. Lights glowing long past midnight. The sound of hammering echoing across the fields after dark. Ezra explained it all away as construction, new rooms, new improvements, for the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician, remembered being summoned to the Sullivan farm many times. Each visit, he was told that an orphan was ill. Yet strangely, he was never permitted to see the child. Constance would stand at the door, describing symptoms, asking for medicine. And when the doctor insisted he needed to examine the patient, she claimed the children were far too frightened of strangers. Even the pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, was deceived. He praised the Sullivans for their Christian charity. He offered to help place the children in new homes. But Constance assured him that her family in Pennsylvania would eventually take them. And so, the deception continued, unchecked. Constance Sullivan always spoke softly, reassuringly. When questioned, she would insist that the children in her care simply required patience, careful placement, and time. What no one realized, what no one could even begin to imagine, was that her gentle explanations were nothing but a mask. For over 2 decades, Constance had been perfecting her deception. Those children weren't temporary guests waiting for families. They were captives. Bought. Kidnapped. Lured away from homes across several states. And held in conditions so vile that even the hardest men would later admit it made them weep. The cracks in her perfect story began to show in early 1834. That winter was merciless. February brought freezing winds and snow that buried farms in silence. For the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, the bitter cold was both curse and salvation. It slowed their captors' routines. But it also meant the damp, airless basement became even more unbearable. On February 23, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was forced off the road by a violent snowstorm. He sought refuge at the nearest building, the Sullivan farm. Ezra Sullivan, visibly reluctant, couldn't refuse shelter to a stranded traveler in such dangerous weather. Later, Stern recalled that night in haunting detail. He described the tension in the house. The way Ezra and Constance exchanged nervous glances. How every creak of the old farmhouse made them startle. Dinner was plain, cornbread and salt pork, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. When Stern asked about the children, Constance explained they were sick, asleep, and must not be disturbed. But that night, as Stern tried to rest on a makeshift bed in the parlor, he heard something. Muffled crying. The sound of children weeping beneath the floor. When he asked Ezra about it the next morning, Sullivan brushed it off, claiming it was nothing more than the wind whistling through the foundation. Stern accepted the explanation, but the memory of those muffled cries never left him. The second incident came just 3 weeks later, on March 15. A young Irish immigrant named Mary Catherine Flynn became separated from her family while traveling toward the tobacco fields near Richmond. Alone, frightened, she stumbled upon the Sullivan farm. Constance welcomed her in. Offered warmth. Food. Shelter. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. Her family reported her missing. A search was organized. But the Virginia wilderness was vast, and after a week with no sign, she was presumed dead, lost to the elements, or claimed by wild animals. No one suspected the farmhouse she had entered that night would be her grave. The final incident, the one that would shatter the illusion forever, occurred on April 2, 1834. Farmer William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits near the Sullivan property when he froze in place at a sound that no parent could mistake. Children. Screaming. Not playful cries, but desperate, panicked shrieks of terror. He crept closer, hiding behind oak trees only 50 yards from the farmhouse. For nearly an hour he listened. The screams rose and fell, always seeming to come from beneath the earth, not from inside the house. At one point, Hutchinson saw Ezra Sullivan slip out from a hidden cellar door. He looked around nervously, then disappeared underground again. When Hutchinson told neighbors, the town split. Some dismissed the sounds as troubled orphans being disciplined. Others began connecting the dots, the large quantities of food Constance always purchased, the strange noises at night, the fact that none of these supposed orphans ever appeared in town or at church gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a respected lawman of 15 years, initially brushed off the concerns as gossip. But Hutchinson persisted, filing a formal complaint. By law, Crawford was required to investigate. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford and his deputy, Marcus Webb, rode out to the Sullivan farm. They expected a routine visit, a quick inspection to silence rumors. Constance greeted them at the door with her usual calm smile, even inviting them inside for coffee. She spoke softly, dismissing the gossip, even producing letters she claimed were from relatives in Pennsylvania. At first, everything seemed reasonable. Until Deputy Webb excused himself to use the privy. Walking around the house, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door. It was secured with 3 heavy padlocks. Chains wound tightly around the handles. And on the wood, deep scratches. Marks that looked like fingernails. As though someone inside had tried to claw their way out. When Webb returned, he quietly told Crawford what he had seen. The sheriff immediately knew this was no ordinary call. Crawford politely asked to see the cellar. Constance froze. Her face drained of color. Her hands trembled. She stammered excuses. The cellar was unsafe, the children weren't allowed there, it was only for storage. And then, the sound came. From beneath their feet, faint sobs. Children crying. A weak voice calling, "Help!" The officers looked at each other. The decision was made. When they forced open the cellar door, the horror that greeted them would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. The stench hit first, an overwhelming reek of human waste, sickness, and something Sheriff Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The basement was vast, an underground maze that stretched far beyond the house above. Carefully mortared stone walls muffled sound. Interconnected chambers formed a secret prison. The largest room, directly beneath the kitchen, held the children. 47 of them. Shackled to iron rings in the walls. Ankle chains granting only a few feet of movement. The children were gaunt, their clothes in tatters. Their skin marred by sores and bruises. Many coughed violently, showing signs of fever and lung disease from the damp air. And yet, after their initial cries, the cellar fell silent. The children just stared at the men with hollow eyes, as if rescue was something they no longer believed possible. Deputy Webb, a father himself, fled twice to vomit in the yard. Even Sheriff Crawford, hardened by years of law enforcement, struggled to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. The smaller chambers revealed even more. One held restraints, stocks, whipping posts, devices for punishment. Another resembled a crude infirmary, stocked with tools and medicines, proof the children were kept alive, not out of mercy, but to prolong their usefulness. A third contained meticulous records. Names. Ages. Dates of arrival. Notes on behavior. From those records, the scope of the operation became clear. Children had been brought to the Sullivan farm since 1812, just after Constance arrived in Millbrook. Some had been bought from overcrowded poorhouses. Others lured as runaways. Still others, simply abducted. In total, more than 90 children had passed through that basement. The question was inevitable. What happened to the others? That answer lay through a narrow passage. Sheriff Crawford crawled through, and what he found chilled him to his core. A hidden burial chamber. The remains of at least 36 children. Some had wasted away from starvation or illness. Others bore marks of violence. All buried in shallow graves beneath the dirt floor, covered with lime to mask the stench of decay. The Sullivan farm was not a refuge. It was a machine. A system of cruelty, perfected over 2 decades. And its secret had finally come to light. Timothy's disappearance sent shockwaves through the fragile investigation. To Sheriff Crawford and the other officials, it was a devastating confirmation of what they had feared all along. The Sullivan network was not only larger than they had imagined, but it also had eyes and influence everywhere. The boy had vanished without a trace, plucked from the very heart of protective custody, as if to prove that the perpetrators could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. The townspeople, already torn between disbelief and horror, were plunged into panic. Some whispered that the boy had been taken by vengeful spirits from the Sullivan cellar, while others, those who understood more of the truth, realized that powerful men with wealth and connections had orchestrated his removal. The disappearance served as a chilling message. No one, not even survivors, would be safe so long as the truth was pursued. Federal marshals doubled their presence in the county, but the sense of dread grew heavier by the day. Deputies rode night patrols around the safe houses, lanterns bobbing in the dark, but the enemy they faced was not an ordinary band of criminals. They were dealing with an organized, well-funded system, families, businessmen, and landowners who operated under the veneer of respectability. The same men who toasted in church pews on Sundays and donated to local schools were the very ones financing the trade in stolen children. Rebecca, the 14-year-old survivor whose testimony had cracked open the network, became the keystone witness. Despite her youth, she spoke with a clarity and force that stunned the courtroom when hearings began. She remembered conversations in detail, the names, the dates, the coded language. But with every word she spoke, the danger to her life grew. Authorities moved her constantly, never letting her stay in one shelter for long. She learned to sleep lightly, waking at the faintest sound, her nerves sharpened by years in captivity and now by the knowledge that powerful men wanted her silenced forever. The investigation into Henry Blackwood of Charleston revealed just how far the rot had spread. Blackwood's plantation was more than a place of labor, it was a laboratory of cruelty. Testimonies from former workers and surviving children described acts so depraved that even hardened federal marshals struggled to put them into words. Children were worked until collapse, then replaced. Some were used in experiments under the guise of medical curiosity, bleeding, starvation trials, exposure to extreme conditions. Others were brought into the Blackwood household, where their fates were even darker. One federal marshal later wrote in his report that uncovering the truth behind Blackwood's purchases was like peeling back the skin of society itself and finding only rot beneath. But Blackwood was not alone. The Sullivan records, paired with Rebecca's memories, exposed a web stretching across state lines, from Pennsylvania down through Maryland, the Carolinas, and into Georgia. Every link in the chain was carefully hidden behind respectable facades. Trading companies, shipping merchants, even clergymen who funneled orphans into the system. Sheriff Crawford, once just a county lawman, now found himself caught in a conflict with some of the most powerful men in the nation. His name appeared in threatening letters, crude sketches of gallows scrawled in the margins. His deputy's attack was only the beginning. Another marshal's horse was found slaughtered, its carcass left outside the courthouse doors. These were not random acts of intimidation. They were declarations of war. Despite the threats, the survivors continued to speak. One after another, children who had been too terrified to whisper a word began to tell their stories. Each testimony painted the same picture, a system designed to strip them of identity, to turn them into nameless, voiceless property. They described how older children were forced to enforce rules upon younger ones, how rewards of stale bread or a warm blanket were used as tools of control, and how anyone who resisted was beaten or made an example of before the others. Rebecca, in particular, spoke of moments burned into her memory. She remembered Ezra Sullivan dragging a boy by his hair across the cellar floor while Constance looked on with cold indifference. She recalled visitors from the cities, wealthy men who inspected the children like cattle, their faces masked by polite conversation and fine clothing. And she remembered something else, coded phrases that passed between Constance and her associates. Words like harvest, shipment, and rotation. Each term, once decoded by federal agents, revealed just how methodically human lives had been catalogued and traded. The missing boy, Timothy, was never found, but whispers suggested he had been reclaimed by the network, either silenced forever or taken southward into the hands of men like Blackwood. His disappearance hardened the resolve of the investigators. What had begun as a local mystery in a quiet rural county had become one of the first truly national manhunts in American history. As the winter of 1830 drew in, federal authorities began making arrests. Safe houses were raided, ledgers seized, and corrupt officials unmasked. But for every breakthrough, resistance stiffened. Judges with ties to Southern landowners dismissed cases. Local juries, swayed by fear or bribery, refused to convict. The network was too entrenched, too protected by wealth and influence to fall easily. Still, the cracks were spreading. The Sullivan farm had been exposed as the heart of a monstrous trade, and the surviving children, Rebecca foremost among them, had lit a fire that could not be smothered. The case was no longer about one farm, one woman, or one family. It was about the soul of a nation grappling with darkness festering beneath its surface. And as investigators pushed deeper into the network, they began to realize something even more chilling. The Sullivan operation had not been the largest, only the most careless. There were whispers of other farms, other basements, hidden far from prying eyes, where children still waited in silence for a rescue that might never come. The story of Constance Sullivan was horrifying enough. But what Rebecca had revealed, and what federal marshals were beginning to uncover, was far worse. America's first true child trafficking empire, a secret so vast and terrible that even those tasked with stopping it feared they were only scratching the surface. The warning could not have been more direct. Anyone assisting the inquiry would pay the price. Yet, despite the threats, investigators pressed forward. Federal marshals tightened protection around essential witnesses, while the surviving children were relocated under guard. Armed officers remained stationed at the Sullivan property to safeguard evidence. What had begun as a criminal case now stood as a measure of whether the nation's legal system could endure against crimes backed by wealth and influence. The strain reached its breaking point when Constance Sullivan herself was discovered lifeless in her cell. Authorities recorded it as suicide, though circumstances suggested otherwise. She had been scheduled to reveal the entire network, naming customers and collaborators. Her sudden death erased the most crucial voice against the conspiracy. The shock reverberated through investigators, for if enemies were willing to silence her, no one tied to the case was safe. The scope uncovered threatened some of the most influential families in the United States. Just as intimidation seemed ready to crush the investigation, a surprising twist shifted the momentum. A man consumed by guilt stepped forward, Samuel Pierce, a former overseer employed by Henry Blackwood. His testimony and documents would unravel the remaining secrecy. Pierce had managed Blackwood's plantation operations and knew intimately the children obtained through Sullivan. Beyond ledgers and correspondence, he possessed direct memories of their fates. His willingness to speak offered investigators the missing proof needed to expose the horrors hidden within America's elite estates. When Pierce appeared before the Richmond grand jury, the nation would remember his testimony as one of the most unsettling ever delivered in a courtroom. Middle-aged, with worn hands and hollow eyes, Pierce described what occurred on Blackwood's land. Investigators, hardened by years of brutality, were staggered by what they heard. According to Pierce, the plantation operated two faces. On one side, cotton fields worked by enslaved labor, grinding yet familiar to Southern commerce. On the other, a separate quarter, the so-called experimental barracks, where trafficked children from Sullivan's network endured something altogether different. Blackwood, joined by two physicians from Charleston Medical College, used them as human test subjects. Their experiments measured endurance, tested and proven drugs, and satisfied a curiosity that saw children as specimens, not souls. Pierce's most damning claim centered on Blackwood's meticulous documentation. He had recorded everything: reactions, survival rates, and diseases intentionally introduced. The files revealed not research but orchestrated torture. At least 37 children had been delivered there, only 4 ever left alive, sold elsewhere. The remainder perished through experiments, neglect, or exhaustion. Buried in shallow, nameless graves, their stories were almost lost until Pierce spoke. Equally damning was his account of the wider network. Pierce recounted discussions where Blackwood negotiated purchases with other planters, businessmen, and even elected officials. The trade extended nationwide, with different clients demanding different traits. The most nightmarish recollection came from autumn 1833, when Pierce observed a gathering Blackwood called a demonstration. Prospective buyers toured the barracks as if at an exhibition. Children were forced to display obedience, resilience, and skill while subjected to punishments to gauge reactions. Attendees handled them like livestock, placing orders by appearance or ability. Several jurors left the room as Pierce spoke. His testimony also revealed the staggering financial machinery. Prices varied by age, condition, or potential. Younger, more malleable children drew higher bids, while certain physical traits commanded premiums. Profits ran into hundreds of thousands, immense wealth for that time. Acting quickly, federal marshals used Pierce's leads to strike in coordinated raids. Targets across the South, including plantations and storage sites, were hit simultaneously. Evidence was seized before it could vanish, and children were freed before they disappeared deeper into the trade. Over 100 victims were rescued. Paper trails, letters, and ledgers were collected, naming high-ranking participants. Arrests included Henry Blackwood, the Charleston physicians, and even a Georgia legislator long shielded by status. The findings stunned the nation. For 3 decades, the network had trafficked hundreds with calculated efficiency. Blackwood's experiments, detailed in his journals, revealed deliberate infection, poison trials, and crude surgeries without anesthesia. The children were reduced to tools for cruel knowledge. Beyond brutality, corruption had kept it alive. Orphanages, poorhouses, and officials accepted bribes to supply children or ignore vanishings. Judges rubber-stamped sham adoptions. Even sheriffs concealed crimes. The trials stretched for years, tangled by jurisdiction and influence. Many defendants escaped conviction through technicalities or allies in high places. Yet, public exposure forced reforms. The Sullivan scandal spurred America's first federal laws against child trafficking, demanded oversight of orphanages, and created new safeguards for vulnerable minors. Though the court process dragged nearly 5 years, the social impact came immediately. Papers nationwide chronicled the horror, some devoting entire issues to it. The children, however, bore lifelong scars. The 47 rescued from Sullivan's basement required extensive medical and emotional care, struggling to reclaim basic human trust. Many never healed fully. Rebecca, the 14-year-old whose testimony had opened doors, became briefly famous for her courage. Yet the spotlight overwhelmed her. A Quaker family in Pennsylvania sheltered her, offering quiet healing. She eventually married, raised children, and lived into her 70s. But she never spoke publicly of her ordeal again. Justice unfolded unevenly. Ezra Sullivan was hanged in Richmond, November 1836, confessing at the gallows to having walked the devil's path. His partner Henry Blackwood stood trial in proceedings that exposed plantation society's darkest truths. Convicted of multiple murders, his sentence to death was delayed by appeals and political wrangling until he died in prison 5 years later, possibly poisoned by his own associates. The Charleston doctors lost both their freedom and profession, their punishment inspiring new medical research regulations. The college itself nearly collapsed amid scandal, accused of tolerating silence. Yet, powerful buyers largely evaded consequence. Some fled overseas, others leaned on political clout. The Georgia legislator, for instance, escaped criminal charges altogether. The financial inquiry revealed staggering sums. Constance Sullivan alone had earned over $12,000 across 2 decades, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. Much vanished into hidden investments. Her farm became infamous. Seized and sold, no one wished to inhabit such cursed ground. In 1845, the house was razed, its basement filled with stone, its land turned into a small cemetery for nameless children. Few graves bore names, but the site stood as a silent marker of one of America's darkest revelations. The Sullivan case did more than terrify, it transformed America. In the aftermath, Virginia passed sweeping reforms, laws unlike anything seen before in this country. For the first time, orphanages faced government oversight. Adoption and guardianship required background checks. No longer could someone simply claim to be acting out of charity without proving accountability. Other states soon followed, laying the foundation of the child welfare system we know today. But it wasn't just state law that changed. The federal government was shaken. The Sullivan case had exposed a frightening reality: when crimes crossed borders, local sheriffs were powerless. In response, Washington passed new statutes, giving federal marshals unprecedented authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking. These laws became the blueprint for modern criminal justice. Perhaps the most lasting shift was cultural. The old, romanticized vision of the benevolent neighbor taking in orphans crumbled. People began to understand the uncomfortable truth: good intentions weren't enough. Vulnerable children needed structure, oversight, and legal protection. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered the American vocabulary, a warning whispered whenever children were left in questionable circumstances. For those caught in the storm, the scars never faded. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had, unknowingly, enabled the deception, was haunted by guilt. His notes, his prescriptions, his blind acceptance of Constance Sullivan's explanations, all weighed heavily on him. But instead of retreating, he transformed. He founded free medical clinics for abandoned children and became one of the earliest advocates for strict medical ethics. His writings, published later in life, were shaped entirely by the shadow of Millbrook. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, the man who had led the raid, was promoted to federal marshal. He devoted the rest of his career to tracking criminals who preyed on children. Crawford pioneered investigative methods that lawmen would rely on for decades: detailed interviews, cross-jurisdictional coordination, and meticulous documentation. His reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for law enforcement across the nation. And the children? Their paths told stories of both resilience and ruin. Some, like Rebecca, the brave girl whose testimony cracked the silence, found stability with proper care. She eventually married, raised a family, and lived into her 70s, though the nightmares never left her. Others struggled. Mental illness, addiction, poverty, the scars of captivity shaped their lives in ways no law could repair. A few never survived adulthood at all, their health shattered by years of malnutrition and confinement. The evidence left behind revealed even more chilling truths. Letters found in the Sullivan basement pointed to other operations, other towns, other children. Some leads brought arrests and convictions. Others turned cold, the trails too faded by time. But investigators realized something far more disturbing: the Sullivans were not an isolated horror. They were a single piece of a larger system, an underground market of exploitation that had quietly existed for decades. It was America's hidden history, buried beneath polite society. The people of Millbrook carried their own burden. For 20 years, they had lived beside a nightmare. How had they missed it? Were they blind? Or had they chosen not to see? The town turned inward, wrestling with guilt. At church, at market, at family tables, the same questions lingered. What signs did we ignore? Could we have stopped this? And what does it mean if evil can flourish right under our noses? The Sullivan case forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth: that communities have a duty to question, to probe, to look closer when something feels wrong. Respecting privacy was no excuse when children's lives were at stake. The legacy of the case stretched far beyond Virginia's borders. Scholars, criminologists, and reformers studied its records for generations. The letters, financial ledgers, and testimony became a chilling archive of how exploitation could thrive inside ordinary communities. And the ending itself was humbling. The Sullivans weren't brought down by elite detectives or cutting-edge science. Their empire collapsed because of courage, simple, ordinary courage. William Hutchinson, who refused to stay silent about what he'd overheard. Sheriff Crawford, who listened and acted instead of dismissing concerns. Rebecca, who stood in court, trembling, and told the truth. It was conscience, not power, that ended one of the darkest crimes in American history. Today, the Sullivan basement remains sealed. Dust covers the stones. The iron chains have rusted into silence. But the echoes remain. They remind us of a chilling lesson: vigilance, courage, and compassion are the only shields we have to protect the innocent. The Sullivan case endures as both a monument to human evil and a testament to the conscience of those who dared to resist it. If this story has unsettled you, good. That means you understand why we must never bury these chapters of history. Evil hides behind respectability. And sometimes, the kindest smile masks the darkest intent. So I'll leave you with this. Do you think the whole truth of the Sullivan case was revealed? Or do secrets still lie buried in the Virginia hills? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more of America's hidden horrors, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming. Because the shadows of history hold many more secrets, and together, we're going to uncover them all.